The Truth About Quantum Mechanics and the Solution to the Hard Problem of Consciousness by Saul Celere. Abstract. In this essay, I provide the correct interpretation of the experiments of quantum mechanics, as well as the solution to the hard problem of consciousness. There is a strong analogy to the Copernican revolution. Before Copernicus, the motions of the sun and the planets were being explained by the Ptolemaic theory. Because this theory relied on the false assumption that the Earth is at the center of the solar system, it was inevitably very confused, convoluted, and unintuitive. By changing the fundamental postulate to heliocentrism, Copernicus was able to construct a clear, simple, and intuitive model of the solar system. Of course, at first his ideas were met with hostility. Thank God we don't burn philosophers at the stake anymore. We begin the essay by stating 6 undeniable propositions about the nature of consciousness in our universe, followed by 2 propositions about energy, along with their respective short proofs. Then we state and describe the old fundamental postulate of consciousness, followed by the new fundamental postulate of consciousness. Then we use the new postulate to develop a simple, logical, and intuitive interpretation of quantum mechanics. And finally, we briefly explain how this change of fundamental postulate immediately solves the long-standing hard problem of consciousness. We begin by stating 6 undeniable propositions about consciousness and 2 propositions about the energy of our universe, along with their respective short proofs. Proposition 1. Consciousness exists in our universe. Proof. You are conscious. You are at this very moment consciously hearing my words. If consciousness didn't exist, the question, what is consciousness, could not possibly ever arise or be contemplated. Therefore, consciousness exists in our universe, at least here on Earth. QED. Proposition 2. The only possible way of knowing about the nature of consciousness is by being conscious. Similarly, the only way to contemplate or theorize about consciousness is through consciousness itself. Proof. By definition, a non-conscious entity can have no experience of consciousness. Reflecting on the nature of anything, including consciousness, is a conscious activity. No contemplation, theorizing, or science, or any reasoning of any kind has ever been carried out except by conscious entities through their consciousness. QED. Proposition 3. Your conscious experience is generated by the physical energy and particles comprising your body and especially your brain. Proof. It is now long established empirical fact that human conscious experience is generated primarily within the brain along with input from the body. From a scientific perspective, the body and brain are composed of nothing except for energy and protons, neutrons and electrons formed into cells and neurons, etc. Thus, the energy and particles forming your body and brain are generating your conscious experience. QED. Proposition 4. Particular conscious states are dependent on the particular physical configurations of energy and particles generating them. Different physical configurations give rise to different conscious states. Proof. Brain scanning technologies now allow us to watch in real time the changes in the physical neuronal configuration of a subject's brain corresponding to changes in their conscious state. Certain drugs and chemicals, for example, cause changes in conscious state by causing physical changes in the chemical configuration of the brain, and permanent changes to the physical structure of the brain, such as brain damage or a lobotomy, cause permanent changes in the conscious experience of the patient. QED. Proposition 5. The energy and particles of our universe are capable, in certain special configurations, of generating conscious states of individual, centralized consciousness. Proof. The energy and particles of your body and brain are giving rise to just such a state at this very moment. Your central nervous system is generating your personal, private, individual, and centralized conscious experience within itself and your body. Your conscious experience is that of one individual conscious being centralized within your body. Even people with multiple personalities only ever feel like one particular individual at a time. QED. Proposition 6. Conscious experience is private. Proof. The only consciousness you have ever directly experienced is your own. You have never directly observed any conscious experience except your own, and neither has anyone else. Whenever we examine or scan a subject's brain, we can only ever observe the objective physical reality of their brains, which is to say groups of neurons. We can never directly observe the contents of their subjective conscious experience. For example, if we ask a subject to imagine a tree, say, we can see groups of neurons firing in appropriate regions of their brain, but we can never see the green and brown tree they're seeing in their mind. QED. Note, this is actually one of the 6 laws of consciousness of this universe, and it has been implicitly acknowledged in philosophy for centuries, where it is known as solipsism. The law can be stated in a number of equivalent ways, such as consciousness is a purely subjective phenomenon, or the only way to directly observe any conscious experience is to be the physical entity generating it, or direct mind reading or mind observation is impossible. It is ignorance of this law that has been the main obstacle of a scientific treatment of consciousness, since a purely objective analysis of a purely subjective phenomenon is impossible. In a future essay, I will state and explain the 6 laws of consciousness of our universe. Now we state 2 propositions about the energy of our universe. Proposition 7. Energy is the basic stuff of our universe. Proof. Everything physical in our universe is either energy or matter. And all matter is a formation of energy, capable of transforming back into pure energy via Einstein's E = mc squared. QED. Proposition 8. All the energy of our universe was born in the Big Bang event. Proof. This is a basic statement of the Big Bang theory. QED. Okay. Now, by proposition 1, we know that consciousness exists in our universe, at least locally here on Earth. There exist 2 and only 2 logical possibilities for the origin of consciousness. Either possibility 1, consciousness came into existence at some time later than t = 0. That is to say, at some time after the initial Big Bang event. Or possibility 2, consciousness came into existence at t = 0, at the same time as the initial Big Bang event, and consciousness is a fundamental property of the stuff of our universe. There are no other possibilities. Possibility 1 is generally known as the theory of emergent consciousness. In emergent theories of consciousness, consciousness is not a fundamental property of the basic energy and particles of our universe. In these theories, the energy born in the Big Bang and the particles subsequently formed out of this energy are totally devoid of consciousness. Then, consciousness somehow arises or emerges in or around particular special configurations of these individually non-conscious constituents. Currently, there exists no sensible theory as to how this happens. It is openly admitted to be a scientific mystery, known as the hard problem of consciousness, which can be stated. How do non-conscious basic constituents come together to give rise to our conscious experience? Despite decades of endeavour attempting to solve the hard problem of consciousness, the mystery remains pristine. This is because possibility 1 is a logical impossibility. Expecting consciousness to somehow emerge out of configurations of constituents that are individually totally devoid of consciousness is logically equivalent to expecting electric charge to emerge out of some special configuration of neutrons. Since individual neutrons possess no electric charge, this can never happen, no matter how cleverly you configure the neutrons. Thus, we are logically compelled to replace possibility 1 with possibility 2 as our a priori postulate for the origin of consciousness. We will call possibility 2 the postulate of fundamental consciousness. According to this postulate, consciousness is a fundamental intrinsic property of the basic energy and particles of our universe, and came into existence at t equals 0 in the Big Bang event. The Big Bang was not only a physical event, but also a conscious one. The basic energy of our universe is conscious, is in fact consciousness. Consciousness that has, since the Big Bang, taken on the various energetic and physical forms described objectively by conventional physics. These physical forms all contain within themselves their corresponding form-dependent subjective conscious state. Thus, energy, amongst its already well-known physical properties, is also conscious, is in fact physical consciousness. And we can state the equation E equals C, where capital E is energy and capital C is consciousness. Now, having stated the correct a priori postulate of consciousness, we can proceed to finally give the correct interpretation of the experiments of quantum mechanics, as well as very logically, intuitively, and simply resolve the hard problem of consciousness. There is a strong analogy here to the Copernican revolution. Copernicus changed the a priori postulate of the solar system from geocentrism, the Earth being at the center of the solar system, to heliocentrism, the sun being at the center. And in doing so, he immediately made sense of the observed motions of the sun and the planets across the sky. So, in the light of the postulate of fundamental consciousness, we first state the old principles for interpreting quantum mechanics, followed by the new principles. And then we use the new principles to logically and intuitively interpret 4 of the most famous experiments of quantum mechanics. Okay, the old principles of quantum mechanics. 1. The basic energy and particles studied in quantum mechanics are devoid of any consciousness. 2. The behaviors of these non-conscious entities in quantum mechanical experiments are the result of an inferred intrinsic probabilism. We say inferred probabilism because there is no observed physical basis generating this probabilistic behavior. It is thought to be simply intrinsic to these quantum entities. 3. The wave function is a mathematical description of the set of possible physical outcomes of a particular quantum mechanical experiment and their relative probabilities of being instantiated on measurement. Okay. These postulates form what is known as the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. Before stating the new principles of quantum mechanics, we note that by proposition 2, we can only understand any conscious behavior with reference to our own experience of consciousness. Since quantum entities such as photons and electrons are the most ancient, basic, and simple constructions of conscious energy in our universe, we assume only the most basic and simple conscious perceptions and abilities. To be extremely clear, when we say that something like an electron is conscious, we are not at all suggesting any sort of human-like self-consciousness or personality, but rather, as the most basic conscious entities in our universe, only the most basic conscious perceptions and abilities. The new principles of quantum mechanics. Principle 1. E equals C. Energy is conscious. Energy is in fact physical consciousness. Principle 2. Individual quantum entities possess some basic conscious perceptions and abilities, including some conscious perception of their local universe. For example, an electron in a magnetic field has some conscious sensation of being in a magnetic field that is different from its conscious sensation of being in free space. And limited free will. That is the conscious ability to choose from limited sets of future alternatives to instantiate. For example, an electron in a magnetic field can choose between aligning itself either spin up or spin down with respect to the field. Principle 3. The wave function is a mathematical description of the set of alternatives from which the quantum entity or system in question can choose to instantiate on measurement. The collapse of the wave function is a conscious act. Note: the outcomes of quantum mechanical experiments are the result of individual quantum entities exercising their basic conscious perceptions and limited free will. The mathematics used to describe quantum mechanics is probabilistic because it is describing conscious behavior. And as we know from the sciences of psychology and economics, conscious behavior is only amenable to a probabilistic mathematical treatment and not to a deterministic one. At first sight, it might seem surprising to think that something like an electron is making a conscious choice when deciding whether to align spin up or spin down. But on reflection, it isn't really surprising at all. For example, yourself, now, you can choose between heads or tails. After a moment or two of uncertainty, contemplating the two essentially equivalent options, you are capable of choosing one. Since you are made of nothing except for energy and protons, neutrons and electrons, and are capable of making a basic conscious choice like this, it makes sense that the basic constituents of your body and brain are also individually possessed of similar basic conscious abilities. Of course, the human body and brain, having taken billions of years to evolve, is a vastly more complex construction of the basic conscious energy of our universe, and as such possesses a correspondingly expanded range of conscious perceptions and abilities, compared to something like an electron. It will be seen that this is the only logical way of solving the hard problem of consciousness. Now we use the new principle of quantum mechanics, along with some general principles derived from the 6 propositions at the beginning of the essay, to logically interpret 4 famous experiments of quantum mechanics. Proposition 4 states, particular conscious states are dependent on particular physical configurations of conscious energy and matter. A corollary to this is that similar physical configurations give rise to similar conscious perceptions and abilities. So, for example, humans are similar configurations of energy and matter to one another, and as such we perceive our local universe in similar ways and react in similar ways under particular physical conditions. An octopus, for example, is a very different configuration of conscious energy and matter to a human, and as such perceives and behaves very, very differently to a human, but similarly to another octopus. What humans and octopi do have in common with one another, they also have in common with quantum entities such as electrons. And that is some conscious perception of their local universe and some limited free will to choose from limited sets of future alternatives to instantiate. Particular species of quantum entities, such as electrons for example, are exceedingly similar, if not identical, formations of conscious energy. As such, we can conclude that they perceive their local universe in very similar ways and possess very similar conscious abilities. This explains why quantum particles behave in the same predictable ways under the same experimental conditions. Now we are ready to correctly interpret the experiments of quantum mechanics. We begin with the quintessential quantum experiment, the two-slit experiment. The two-slit experiment. Given that this is probably the most famous experiment of modern science, I'll assume the listener is familiar with the basics of the experiment. In this experiment, electrons, as well as other particles and atoms, exhibit wave-particle duality, which is when a particle exhibits wave-like and particle-like behavior at different times in the same experiment. In this experiment, electrons are emitted one at a time from a source, and then travel to and land on a screen. Between the source and the screen is a barrier, with two slits in it, through which the electrons can pass. The electrons make a distinctive pattern on the screen, called an interference pattern. The electrons group in bands on the screen, and between each of these bands of electrons is a band where no electrons ever land. Before this experiment, interference patterns were known to be a phenomenon of light waves, hence the conclusion of wave-particle duality. Based on the interference pattern made by the electrons, we infer that each electron travels through space and through the slits as a wave before collapsing back into its particular form at the screen. We can only infer the wave behavior because any attempt to directly observe the wave causes it to collapse back into a particle. The passage of the electron wave through the two slits separates it into two wave fronts, one emanating from each slit. The two wave fronts then interfere with one another in the same way two wave fronts of light interfere with one another. Where the two wave fronts interfere constructively, the resultant electron wave has a greater magnitude, and at corresponding points on the screen, more electrons land. Where destructive interference occurs, the resultant magnitude is smaller, and fewer electrons land. Where destructive interference reduces the magnitude of the resultant wave to zero, no electrons ever land. The conventional interpretation of this behavior is to say that the electron is an intrinsically probabilistic entity, and its waveform at any point is proportional to the probability of the electron collapsing into a particle at that point. Technically, it's the square of the modulus of the wave that's proportional to the probability, but that doesn't affect our argument. However, postulating fundamental consciousness makes for a much simpler and much more logical and intuitive explanation. Now, the waveform or wave function isn't proportional to the probability of the electron landing at a particular point. Rather, it's an inferred measure of the electron's conscious perception of its local universe. An electron perceives its local universe in the form of a wave. On leaving the source, the electron becomes a wave of conscious perception. This wave of conscious perception passes through the slits and interferes in the usual way waves interfere. Places on the screen where the wave has greater magnitude are places the electron can more clearly consciously perceive. And where it has lesser magnitude are places the electron perceives more dimly. Naturally, the electrons move into and land in areas of the screen they can more clearly perceive. And where the wave has zero magnitude, the electrons never land, since they have zero perception of these areas. And like all conscious entities, the electrons tend to go where they can more clearly perceive, and never move into places of which they have no conscious perception. In essence, as it travels through space, the electron becomes its own light, a light that has some local conscious perception. When this wave of perception encounters the impassable screen, it chooses a place on it on which to land, as a particle, and of course chooses a place it can clearly perceive. How does it make the choice? Through its intrinsic consciousness and limited free will. The same way you might perceive and then choose a place to sit on the grass, for example. As an analogy, a human in the dark with a torch will walk into the same direction as the torchlight. Then, in this analogy, wave-particle duality is a particle becoming its own torchlight, by which it chooses a position to collapse. In the next essay, I'll describe a new experiment, a new simple testable hypothesis that shows entities we already know to be conscious, specifically bats, generating interference patterns, proving that interference patterns are generated by conscious entities, corroborating my theory that the interference pattern observed in two slit experiments are being generated by very basic conscious entities. I will also dedicate a whole essay to the observer effect and the destruction of the interference pattern. Okay, now let's look at quantum tunneling. A quantum particle encounters a potential barrier. If the barrier isn't too steep, then there is some probability that the particle will tunnel through the barrier to the other side. Conventionally, this has been explained by saying the particle will tunnel some percentage of the time because it is an inherently probabilistic entity. Now let's explain this behavior by way of fundamental consciousness. The particle has some conscious perception of its local universe, including some conscious perception or sensation of the potential barrier. If the particle senses that the barrier is shallow enough, then tunneling is a member of the imaginational set of future states from which it can choose to instantiate. If large numbers of the particle are exposed to the same potential barrier, some percentage will consciously choose to tunnel through it, and some percentage will choose not to. We can imagine any number of analogous experiments involving more complex constructions of conscious energy and matter that we know are conscious. For example, we send a rabbit down a passageway where it consciously encounters a barrier. On carrying out this experiment a large number of times, we will find that some percentage of the time the rabbit will choose to hop over the barrier, and some percentage of the time it will turn back from the barrier. A wave function could then be written to describe this behavior mathematically. The wave function would give the probability of a rabbit hopping over a barrier of a specified height. The percentage of rabbits that choose to jump over the barrier will decrease as the height of the barrier is increased, and will go to zero once the barrier reaches some critical height, in exact analogy to quantum mechanical tunneling experiments and wave functions. Note: it is important to note here that if some intelligent alien species, or AI, whose physical form was very different from terrestrial life, were to conduct this experiment, they might very well not recognize the rabbit behavior as consciousness, and to decide that rabbits are intrinsically probabilistic entities, making the same mistake we humans have historically made in studying quantum behavior. Okay, next, muon decay. Muons are constructed such that they inevitably decay into specific sets of smaller particles. Muons decay after an average of 2.2 microseconds. But the moment any particular muon will decay cannot be exactly predicted. We can only say there is a certain probability of a particular muon decaying after a given time. Conventionally, this is explained by saying muon decay is an inherently probabilistic phenomenon. Now let's explain it by way of fundamental consciousness. A muon is formed in such a way that its decay is inevitable. Before it decays, the muon has some conscious perception or sensation of its physical need to decay. After approximately 2.2 microseconds, the urge to decay becomes irresistible, and the muon consciously wills or allows itself to decay. The most natural analogy in this case is to childbirth, though it mustn't be taken too literally. A pregnant female is physically constructed such that after around 9 months the urge to give birth or decay becomes irresistible. Pregnant human females decay after a mean lifetime of 9 months. Of course, in this case, unlike a muon, the mother survives the decay process. Now, next, the Stern-Gerlach experiment. Electrons possess intrinsic angular momentum, known as spin. When electrons pass through a magnetic field in a Stern-Gerlach apparatus, they always align their spin in either the same direction as the magnetic field or else in exactly the opposite direction of the magnetic field. They never align in any other direction. In which of the two directions the electron aligns its spin is conventionally thought to be determined by an intrinsic probabilism, the probability depending on the direction of the electron's spin relative to the magnetic field before entering it. Now, postulating fundamental consciousness. Aligning spin up or spin down is a conscious choice made by the electron. If before entering the magnetic field, the electron's spin is already inclined more towards one of the two directions, the electron will be more likely to choose to align in that direction, but can still choose the other direction and will do so some percentage of the time. If before entering the magnetic field the electron's spin is aligned exactly between the upwards and downwards directions of the magnetic field, that is to say at a right angle to the field, then 50% of the time it will align upwards and 50% downwards. From this we can conclude that being aligned spin up or spin down are equivalent states from the electron's conscious perspective, and that all that matters to the electron is that its spin doesn't project into the magnetic field at all. It is then quite natural to assume that the electron always chooses to align parallel or anti-parallel to the magnetic field, because these are the most pleasant or least unpleasant ways for it to exist within a magnetic field. That to project its spin into the magnetic field is consciously unpleasant or less pleasant than aligning parallel to the field. In a future essay, I will show how we can use very simple assumptions based on a pleasure-pain principle or pleasant-unpleasant sensation principle applied to physical states to construct conscious cosmologies, in which biological evolution naturally arises. We can already see physical entities operating by this principle everywhere in nature. All conscious beings strive to avoid unpleasant conscious states and to move towards and to settle in pleasant ones. So it is unsurprising to see the same principle being followed by the basic entities out of which nature is constructed. Okay, that's the end of the experiments. But the whole corpus of quantum mechanical experiments can be simply and logically interpreted using the postulate of fundamental consciousness. The program is very simple. The wave function is a mathematical description of the set of alternatives from which the quantum entity or system can choose to instantiate. The collapse of the wave function is a conscious act, not a probabilistic one. None of the existing mathematics of quantum mechanics needs to be modified at all, since we are not denying or contradicting any of the physical outcomes of the experiments. We are simply providing the correct metaphysical interpretation of these physical outcomes. Any theory that makes use of wave functions and the collapse of wave functions, such as quantum field theory, string theory, etc., can also be simply logically and completely interpreted by postulating fundamental consciousness in place of probabilism. And of course, it makes much more sense to postulate fundamental consciousness rather than probabilism, since you are made of nothing but these basic entities, and you are conscious and spend all your life making conscious choices. Conclusion. I begin with a quote endorsing my theory from one of the greatest of the founding fathers of quantum mechanics, as well as one of the very greatest physicists of all time. Consciousness cannot be accounted for in physical terms, for consciousness is absolutely fundamental. It cannot be accounted for in terms of anything else. Erwin Schrödinger. The set of physical things that humans believe to be conscious has been expanding for centuries. Not very long ago, it was common for philosophers and scientists to even doubt whether animals apart from humans are conscious. Now no one doubts that their dog is conscious, for example. And there is an ever-expanding range of experimental evidence demonstrating that plant consciousness exists. This expansion of the set of conscious things will inevitably include the basic energy and particles of our universe. At first thought, it might seem strange to believe that things like electrons are conscious, but then you have to remember that you're composed of nothing but just such entities, and you're conscious. If all the energy and matter comprising your body and brain are devoid of consciousness, then how can you possibly be conscious? Postulating fundamental consciousness immediately solves this hard problem of consciousness. Now we can understand the hard problem has been concealing an assumed falsehood, namely that basic energy and matter are devoid of consciousness. This is a millennia-old assumption, and it's a false one. It is a simple prejudice, owing to the fact that the basic entities studied in quantum mechanics are such different constructions of conscious energy to humans. So different that it has taken 100 years to recognize their behavior as being the result of their intrinsic consciousness. There exists no logical reason to assume that the energy born in the Big Bang didn't possess some irreducible consciousness from the very first moment, however basic, dim, or alien it may have been. And once we reflect on how many logical and philosophical problems this new postulate allows us to resolve, our scientific intuition can't help but to accept it as truth. For example, let's very briefly compare the two competing theories of how you are conscious. The old theory. The energy born in the Big Bang was and remains non-conscious. Particles evolved out of this energy and are likewise non-conscious. Their behavior is generated by an intrinsic probabilism. These non-conscious particles group together into atoms, molecules, and cells, and ultimately ourselves. At some point in this evolution, after achieving some level of complexity, consciousness somehow discontinuously switched on. No one has any idea how this happens. The theory of emergent consciousness is much more an absence of a theory than a theory. My theory, to be much more developed in following essays. Energy was born in the Big Bang. Amongst its well-known properties, it is also conscious, possesses some consciousness, however basic and dim it may be. Some conscious perception or sensation of the local universe around it, as well as some limited free will. The basic particles evolved out of this conscious energy and are likewise conscious. Through various evolutionary processes, these basic conscious particles came together to form more complex configurations of consciousness. This evolution involved an incomprehensibly large number of conscious decisions that until now were thought to have been made by some mysterious intrinsic probabilism. As the complexity of the forms increased, so did their ranges of conscious perception, conscious imagination, and their conscious abilities. Or in other words, intelligence. Locally, this evolution of complexity has culminated in the human brain, the most complex and therefore the most intelligent object known to humanity. The human brain is the only construction of consciousness we know of so complex that it is capable of contemplating its own existence and function. This self-reflection is an extremely advanced conscious ability that has taken 13.5 billion years to evolve here on Earth. Then, when a consciousness as advanced as human consciousness looks at the most basic conscious behavior of things like electrons, it is capable of quite completely describing and accurately predicting it in most physical situations. And this behavior is so simple and predictable that at first sight it doesn't appear to be the result of consciousness. But of course it is, because if none of the energy and particles you're made of possess any consciousness, then neither would you. And you are, believe it or not, a conscious vibration in the mind of the one true God, whose latest appellation is love. QED. In my next essay, I will refute some anticipated objections. I will expand on the solution to the hard problem of consciousness and the nature of human consciousness, and explain the essential difference between classical physics and quantum physics, as well as discuss limited free will versus the illusion of determinism, explaining how mathematics is used to describe physical reality. I'll also give an explanation of the revolutionary new chess computer AlphaZero, and I will also present 3 new experiments, 3 new simple testable hypotheses that will corroborate my theory. HBKB.